Welcome to the Appalachian Heritage Woodshop, woodworking with an Appalachian flair.
This is Jerill with the Appalachian Heritage Woodshop. Today I want to talk to you about cutting a profile on the edge of a board. Now there are a lot of different methods to do that. I want to talk to you about one of the methods, and that is a molding head. Now in the woodworking production industry, they have large multi-head machines, big chunks of metal that have cutters in it, and the wood is automatically fed through, and the board is molded very fast, very efficiently, and that is a production multi-head machine. That same technology, taking a large chunk of metal, a molding head, and putting it on the shaft of a shaper, will convert a shaper to a molding head also, where you can put individual cutters in it. And that's become very popular. Way back in the 1960s, there was a couple of companies that came out with a molding head that fit on a radial arm saw and a table saw, and that was aimed at the small hobby wood shop. And those were very popular, they were very versatile, and they were very inexpensive. Craftsman marketed a lot of those. I don't know who produced it for them, but I know they sold a lot of them. I know Skil also sold some, Delta also sold some. So there were several companies that were doing it. And that was back in the 1960s, 1970s. Then when the router table emerged and became a dominant force in the woodworking industry in the 1980s, then the molding head just pretty much died out. So there are some companies that make them now, but they're not as dominant on the market. You can still get the cutters for these old heads. So if you ever get a chance to get any of these old heads at a garage sale or a flea market or anything, you ought to grab them. They're a very inexpensive way of producing molding, a very accurate way, and you can custom grind your cutters. Now let's look at some of the parts to these molding heads. They're a very simple design. As you can see, it looks like a saw blade. They were produced where they would have one cutter, or produced with two cutters, or produced with three cutters. And I highly recommend the one with three cutters. It gives you a much smoother cut, and it's easier to control as opposed to the single or the double cutter. If you get any, make sure you get the ones that have a little indexing groove in it. That indexing groove self-aligns all the cutters, so they're aligned when you put them in there and lock them in place, and you don't have to fool with trying to get everything aligned up. It's a very simple system. Now the way it works, the cutter has a little groove, and it just slides right in, and then there is a locking screw, set screw, and you just take the Allen wrench and tighten that up. And when you tighten that up, that will go into this little hole that you see. The screw goes into the hole at an angle and pulls that down into the head and locks it in place and aligns it. The other part is these were designed for radial arm saws and table saws. And some of the radial arm saws and table saws had a 3/4 inch arbor, a shaft, and some have a 5/8 shaft. So they mass produced these with a 3/4 inch hole and then supplied with a bushing that goes in there if you are using it on a radial arm saw or table saw with a 5/8 of an inch shaft. So that's important. And then the other thing you need to be aware of is this little spacer. This spacer is very, very important. You got to have that. Now before I show you how this works, let's look. There's many different cutters available. Several different profiles. The one that I have on my table saw here is a beading cutter. So I'll be doing that. If you ever get any of these that are what's called a blank, a straight one, you can take these and custom grind these to your own profile. There's a lot of different options here. Let me set this out of the way. Well, before I do, I'll show you these cutters are high-speed steel. They're not carbide tipped, so they're very easy to sharpen. I just take 600 grit sandpaper, wet dry sandpaper, and put it on a hard surface, flat surface like the table saw. And it really just takes a couple minutes, and all you're doing is honing the back and getting rid of some of the mill marks and sharpening the edge of the cutting edge. And that's all there is to it. So touch them up between uses and they work great. Now, when you go to put this on a table saw, if you're using a small molding cutter, and especially if you are molding very small pieces, you can use a zero clearance insert so that just the molding head cutter sticks up through it. But the one that I'm using is 1 inch wide, so I've taken an old dado insert and ground it down, because the dado insert's 13/16 wide, and the widest molding cutters you can get for these are 1 inch, and this is a 1 inch cutter. So I've ground this down and put it in there, locked it in place. I've got my fence set up. I've got an auxiliary sacrificial fence on here. So part of the cutter is buried into this fence so that it is aligned the way I want it aligned. And there's the profile, a nice job on the edge of the board, very simple. These are easy to use. You can put hold downs and feather boards on it to keep it aligned. And of course you can do the face as well as the edge. Now don't be intimidated by the sound of the molding head. The sound is the cutters going through the air, and down inside the table saw here, the tolerance, the clearance is very small, so that's what makes this noise. So don't be intimidated by that. This is a good way of creating a nice profile on a board, and if you have a lot to do, once you get it set up, it's very quick and very easy. So this is another option to do molding with. This is Jerill Vance with the Appalachian Heritage Woodshop reminding you, be proud of your Appalachian heritage.